Welcome, everyone. I'm Angelo Robles, and welcome to Family Office TV. I'm also the founder and CEO at SFO Continuity, a private membership organization. Reach out, learn more, and Family Office Masterclass, the deepest educational platform globally for family offices or those that want to find out and learn how to create or reimagine into an incredible single family office. Doing something that I don't think I've done since I launched Family Office TV, and that is do a part two, because we apparently didn't get enough from part one. So many of you know in December, I spent a lot of time in Vienna, had an opportunity to learn so much, to meet with amazing families, amazing people in general. And I did an interview. If you did not hear it yet, go listen to the part one. It was called Legacy Lessons of a 1,000-Year-Old European Family. It featured Octavian Pilati. And it was great to meet him in person, to be there. And nothing quite beats that. So now I'm back in the US. I'm in my studio, not quite as warm. But that was a pretty quick, maybe 28, 29-minute interview. We're going to have a little bit more time to go into depth on some of those topics, but more time to bring up new. And again, it's not often we have a chance to learn from someone that could trace family lineage going back over 1,000 years to a family that has had a level of success, of wealth. And I think, like the title says, Legacy Lessons of a 1,000-Year-Old European Family. I think we could all benefit from it. On that note, without further ado, let's welcome our special guest, Octavian Pilati. Octavian, how are you?
I'm good. How about yourself?
Good, good. It's a pleasure to see you, although virtually again. And I very much enjoyed meeting you in our initial conversation. Again, many of you, probably the easiest way is to go to one of my YouTube platforms at Family Office TV or at Family Office. And I do recommend watching part one, which was in person in a beautiful setting in Vienna. So I'm sure you'll enjoy it. I'll give a little bit of the latest of recap if you're just watching this anew, and then we'll get right into it. We spoke about what it's like to be part of a family legacy and history of wealth and success that goes back over 1,000 years. And it's not all smooth, as you can imagine. There's challenges where often the wealth may come and go a little bit. But what lessons were learned that were passed on generation after generation? And I think those were very intriguing discussions, and parts of that we'll dive a little deeper into today. We did speak about, I mentioned the greatest threat to the family is the family, and Octavian agreed, but also reminded me the greatest advantage to the family could potentially also be that greatest threat, the family itself. We spoke a little bit, to some degree, about his family history. We spoke a little bit about the importance of families back in the day that put people in position if you were a prominent family in government and military and clergy. And I may ask in this interview, in today's world, are those three core industries of yore, for lack of a better word, industries, let's go with it, don't be offended, anyone, how that would maybe adapt in today's world. And we did talk about, which was a decent part of my trip to Vienna, to understand legacy assets, things like land, like art, like gold, and like gems, that families that often go back a long, long time still are active in those assets and resources to this day. On that note, let us begin anew. So, Octavian, a shout out to someone that I met and a wonderful person in talent, and that would be Professor Christina Wing at Harvard. I looked at one of her LinkedIn posts, and it really struck me about how important. She wrote about all successful family businesses and family offices have one thing in common. They originate with an entrepreneur and their willingness to take risk. Therefore, I reposted and commented, and you had a wonderful comment as well that spoke about kind of the importance of refurbishing entrepreneurship, not just once every 3 generations, but perhaps as commonly as every generation. If you could expand on that a little bit, please.
Well, first of all, if you look at old European families, that's what we have done through many generations. It's always educating the next generation to be entrepreneurial and to build upon the wealth that's already been built. I mean, if you just look at it from a numbers perspective, with every generation, the amount of family members and increases. So the wealth if you want to sustain the same amount of wealth per person in the family, needs to increase as well. And you usually, by preservation strategies, you don't get that. Preservation in itself already says that you're trying to keep the level of wealth that you have the same. But on a per capita basis in the family means that that will decrease. So each generation should really try and use the resources and assets they have to continue building upon that. Does that mean that everyone in every generation is capable of doing it, wants to do it, should do it? It doesn't, but at least you should try to educate them to have this understanding of entrepreneurship, to know what it is like to build your own thing, to know what it is like to handle money and resources and what you can do with it.
Of course. And these are things that I've learned in some ways the hard way, but being in the community for 20 years plus in some regards. And I think you hinted at it. As the family evolves and grows over generations, they're likely to have more family members. Therefore, there's more people pulling at resources inside the family. There may be more forced or liquidated trust distributions and or foundational distributions that need to be done. You also have the impact of this life, inflation, of taxes, and eventually that takes its toll. We all know the saying of shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. Now, I'm going to probably make the point that, again, going back to is the greatest threat to the family, that likely is going to be that being the biggest issue for the 3 generations. But the issue of entrepreneurship weaves into that because entrepreneurship, again, or lack thereof over time could be the greatest threat, or if it's done right, could be, quote unquote, among the things that apply to the greatest advantage. Which, again, a family getting a conservative 4 to 5% return, if they have a big corpus, may sound good. And you're probably going to be pretty safe, maybe even for decades. But inevitably, that will erode. Purchasing power could greatly erode. Therefore, the ability to still take some calculated risk, I think, is going to be very, very important. If you could look at your family, perhaps even in the last 100 years, which is a blink of an eye for you, let alone going back 1,000+ years, how could you think of examples where entrepreneurship was both encouraged, was put in position to perhaps be more successful, and it did contribute to the family?
Maybe let me begin with an example where it wasn't encouraged, and that led to some issues, because that's a bit of an easier one, and it goes hand in hand. So in World War II, most of the family members, so my great-grandfather had 4 daughters, and they all married, and all of their husbands were military men. They were all soldiers. It was World War II. They were trained as soldiers. They had high skills as soldiers, but they weren't trained as entrepreneurs. And all the daughters weren't trained to be entrepreneurs either. They were, back then, you didn't really train women. It was just as the time as it was to be an entrepreneur. Usually they did something else. My grandmother, for example, was trained to be an opera singer. So there was a general lack in entrepreneurship, and they did have quite a hard time after World War II to rebuild, and they had to really step on this learning curve after the war, rather than having it instilled in them from the beginning. So that kind of led to a decrease in wealth due to this lack of also risk appetite. We took a lot of very safe decisions and went with rather safer things, not too much risk. And in hindsight, you're always smarter, of course. So looking back on it from now, more entrepreneurial spirit in the family would have been a very good thing to have, because after World War II, there was also a lot of time where you could make a lot of money, which we didn't manage to capitalize on. So that's that one part. And in old families, or at least in my family, usually it would have been the oldest son that was trained to be taking over the estates, to be an entrepreneur, also usually to be a politician in the court, and the second son would be trained to become a military man, and as we discussed, the third son would usually be encouraged to enter the clergy. So that obviously is not as easy to translate nowadays, because is it the right thing to force a certain position upon a child from birth on? I disagree with that method nowadays, but looking at it, that is one of the secrets why the family could keep the wealth over a long, long time, because from day zero, you trained people for what was expected of them and what they were going to face being a wealth owner. Were they handling their estates themselves? No. There was always an estate manager, or when someone who was managing the mills or the forestry operation. That wasn't really managed itself, but they knew how to be entrepreneurs. They knew how to be responsible owners of wealth and what it means, and you learn what you can do with the resources. So we all can probably agree that if you start a new venture, there's a massive difference between having resources to start it or having no resources to start it. And I think that is one of the biggest realizations for family members to have.
We will dive into that because resources shortly, because resources may not only be financial. There's other aspects of family connectivity, of knowledge that also is valuable and may even put the rising generation in position to, I don't know if I'd quite say the word bootstrap it more, but there's lessons to be learned with that. After our first interview and a little bit of work I did with one of our families here in the US, they wrote me this note. There are families in the US that now have built what could be 1,000-year family wealth basis. Now it's essential to understand what it means to be a truly ancient family. It turns out, his words, it's not business and wealth building, it's family and family continuity across many generations, a thing that can be, for some, vastly harder than mere making of money. So, yes, some families did reach out to me saying, wow, 1,000 years of family legacy. Again, wealth could kind of ebb and flow, financial wealth a little bit here and there, of course. And yes, there are American families. We would know them as iconic Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, of people like Warren Buffett and many, many others. It's been the wealthiest country for many a decade. So there's lots of wealth being created in theory. Now, again, there's always things that could happen with government, but in theory, that might be enough of a base at billions of dollars. Yet somehow, I bet you 99% of them, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, it will be wickedly dissipated. What advice, besides I highly recommend they reach out to you, what advice would you have to that comment about they now have probably all the wealth they need in theory in today's dollars for a long time? How do they pursue or propagate family continuity over many, many generations, if you had to simplify it?
If I had to simplify it, for me, it boils down to a few things. First of all, it's education. Starting early, teaching people how to have the right kind of values, to find what drives them, and to put that to work in whatever it is. For some, it may be philanthropic enterprises. For others, it is art, or maybe it is business. And so this falls into building the right kind of character with the next generation. And this is usually done by spending the time with your next generation. So if you outsource it, you don't, if you just get a nanny and the nanny spends time with the kids, that's not transported properly. So the family needs to put in the effort there to educate the next generation. Not all of it themselves, but they need to be in there and invest a lot of time. And that time is a very good investment. So that is probably the most important part to having this long-standing capacity for the family to continue. And that is passed down through every generation. Times change, but there's a lot of things that, like having a work ethic, understanding what a dollar is worth, and things like that. That needs to be instilled by the family into the family members. If that's lacking, you have a problem. Secondly, it's, as you already hinted at, important to understand that you have a great wealth basis in financial terms. But what about the other types of capital that you have as a family? And you can dice them up in different sections. Some people talk about 4 types of capital, others 5. But it essentially, those types of capital are very important. You can lose all your financial capital in a generation and bounce back because of the other types of capital that you have.
Mhm.
Things like knowledge that runs within the family that isn't easily acquired. Relationships, so social capital. You can lose your money, but if your name opens doors for you, because people give you this chance based on the history and the legacy of your family, you can bounce back from anything, or you can get chances that quite simply others will not get because they're unknown. And we only talked about the character building, so that would be, some people call it spiritual capital. I like to call it the cultural capital of a family. The way you behave and transport yourself is a massive advantage if this is instilled in you properly from birth on.
Excellent. I think that's a great answer that I think especially my US centric families needed to hear. It is more than just financial. Not discounting that. You may even say that's the most important, and you might be right. But again, families that have sustained century after century, it is deeper. Look at the work and the interview that I've done with JUs and others. And for those of you that are maybe newer to this, but have a greater understanding of quote unquote multiple, he actually uses 6 forms of wealth. Talking a little bit about that, maybe what you guys do at Hippocampus, one of your companies with you and your partner, Nick, and you guys are probably among the most eloquent that I've seen at it, the work of synchronization leading into what I would define as critical thinking, decision-making, and a governance framework. Governance in the most simple terms being, how do we make decisions as a family?
Well, there's different approaches to governance. There's the top-down approach, which people like to use. You write up a family constitutions with rules and regulations, and then you expect people to stick to it. How do you go about the rules and regulations? One generation just decides something, usually the people in power, and the others have to stick to it. You can also do a bottom-up approach where we say we come together and it's not one person or the patriarch deciding. We decide what we want to stick to and revisit this regularly. In general, when you talk about something like synchronizing family members, this is more about, it's not communism in a family where you say every family member is the same or something, but it's about having a common understanding of what you want to achieve as a family and how you want to be as a family. So how do we want to behave? How do we want to invest? What's important to us? These kind of things that need to be the foundation for anything you build on top of that.
And maybe we could talk a little bit, and that all relates to what I'm going to be asking. Financial wealth without purpose is deemed to be obviously a poor glue to keep families united and happy generationally. It likely fosters a sense of entitlement, elicits compensation strategies to fill the purpose gap. As you could say, the context denies family members what some would say is a meaningful life. Now, I know those that don't come from money are going to look at that and say, Angelo, are you crazy? No, trust me. There is a burden, you could say, to quote unquote inheriting a legacy and wealth. Some use the word stewardship. Some hate that word stewardship because it almost implies it's like a forced job. I'm throwing a lot at you there because there's lots of layers within that. But what would you say to that?
Well, a family legacy, there's different facets to it. I like to call it, you should sit down and do a SWOT analysis of your family legacy. What are the strengths of our particular family legacy, but what are the weaknesses? And which opportunities come towards us due to the legacy, and which threats do we get? So just what people don't think about is the typical threat. You are a young family member with a name, people know with money, you will have a lot of people trying to befriend you because of the money. And this is something very hard to learn, and usually you learn it through making mistakes, and they're very painful mistakes. That's takes a while to learn, and we all have to learn it when you have a legacy to come from. It happens to everybody. As I mentioned earlier, there's opportunities thrown your way because your name opens doors for you. You get investment opportunities that you wouldn't get otherwise. And depending on which values you have been instilled with from the family, you have certain strengths that the legacy brings to you, and also certain weaknesses. So that's kind of like in grand themes. There's nothing in life is just purely good or purely bad. Everything has its light sides and its dark sides. And when it comes to finding your purpose, I agree with you. Money itself is a very bad purpose, and this is a very, very bad social glue. The only reason I meet with family members is because there's money, it's a burden. It's heavy on your shoulders, because and probably everybody who comes from a family of wealth can kind of relate to this. There will be family members you wouldn't be speaking to if you didn't have to, because you're stuck in a holding entity with them or something. Yeah. So and if it has reached this level, it's never going to get great. And this can be transported into the next generation, and the kids will not like each other because the parents didn't like each other, but they don't actually know why. It's like the monkeys in the banana experiment. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that.
Of course.
Yeah. So, and I can speak from my own personal experience, and I've seen it in many other next gens. The family legacy and the wealth can actually delay greatly the time it takes you to discover your own life's purpose and passions. Everybody has to go on his own travels to search for what is it that you like to do. The only way to find this out is by trying many things. And many people don't get the luxury due to the legacy or to the wealth. Particularly if there's a family business, it's expected of you in some families to enter that business. There's no trying out things. It's like, this is what you're going to do, and you're going to go into this family business we have, and you're going to take it over. That's how it's done in some families. No one cares if that's your purpose or your passion. Or having all these resources at your disposal, you just don't know what to do. You could do anything. There's too many choices. So it's death by choice. And those can be just a few issues. Or some families go down the route that they say, okay, we want to protect our kids from this wealth. And then at a certain age, there's all this, there's no pressure at all. So if you're familiar with the stress and performance curve, there's an optimum amount of stress you want to have to be forced to make these decisions, to be forced to try out things, to learn. If that stress is too high, you break. If that stress is too little, you will, what's the term? When there's not enough stress, you bore out. And you get into maybe drugs or alcohol, and you just party your life away. So those are kind of like the, let's say, wealth problems that come at you as a next gen.
Indeed. Actually, I think it was Viktor Frankl that stated, men devoid of purpose numb themselves with pleasure.
Yeah, they fall in an existential vacuum.
Yes. The most common regret among the rising generation that I hear some say in my research and my work over decades is, I wish I had the courage to live a life true to myself, not what others expected of me. And I think that relates a little bit to my doubting a little bit the word stewardship, because I do think it could be an undue burden that is almost forced upon someone that maybe doesn't just speak up and say, I'm just not interested. Now, I'm not saying that's the right attitude too. I think it's complicated. But I think that word courage and the right to live their life true to themselves and not what others expected is a very profound comment.
I agree.
If the rising generation can't succeed, this is related. If they're always fearful and living in the shadows, I believe I read often the difference between a successful person and failure is not that one has better abilities or ideas, but the courage, again, that word courage again, that one has to bet on one's own ideas, to take a calculated risk and to ask. I think this goes back to the entrepreneurial issue that we brought up earlier. And again, there's risk in being an entrepreneur. So how do you work with rising generation family members, kind of on that 1-2 punch that I just asked, becoming true to themselves and not living within the shadow of the family, and understanding that the word courage, which maybe for some is hard to wrap the arms around exactly what that means. It may mean different things to different people, but the ability to act true to yourself and the ability to, in some ways, maybe not being an entrepreneur, but taking risk is going to be important. We can't always live in a cocoon.
Well, it's difficult to generalize because every family is different, every person is different, so that makes a host of different, let's say, situations that you can find a person in. In general, if the family, let's say you have the family is supportive of entrepreneurship, or you could call it family intrapreneurship, where you say, okay, we encourage entrepreneurial endeavors and we're also happy to invest in a family member's entrepreneurial ideas, and we educate them to be able to make these mistakes and we step it up. Give you an example from my upbringing. When I turned 14, my dad gave me 2 choices for my birthday. He said, well, you can get nothing for your birthday. I mean, it's not a great choice, but that's often how life is. Or I'll give you, in today's money terms, it's 10,000 euros that you have to invest in the Austrian stock market, and you have to pay the money back to me because it's a loan. So I learned what a loan is and what it means. It was interest-free, at least. Didn't put that much pressure on me. And with any money you make with your trading or investments, you can buy whatever you want. And I really wanted a new computer back then. And I was like, wow, okay, I'll give it a go. It worked out fine. I ended up being able to pay him back and buy a new gaming computer and be very happy at about 15 years of age or 16 years of age. And that was a little, okay, that was my dipping my feet in investing in that case. I always had to do jobs in the summer. So I had to learn this working and mowing the lawn for the neighbor, working in doing little jobs for one of our family businesses and things like that. So just this slowly working it up. What can be also another burden for family members is this fear of failure because of the family name. There's a lot at stake. You don't want to bring shame on the family by basically screwing it up when you try something. So, and that is, again, if the family does it well, they encourage family members to try out things and it's okay. And there's a certain failure safety net that you can fall into and it's going to be okay. In some families, that's not the case. And then the person has to do more work on a personal level to understand, okay, discern between the family legacy and yourself. Of course, the family legacy is somehow part of you, but it's not you. It's not your identity. You have your own identity, and the family legacy is something that you need to integrate into your own identity. And in some cases, when you grow up with the strong family legacy standing above you, you're in the shadow of your elders all the time, and your whole sense can get totally warped. For example, if your great-grandfather became a billionaire, this is like the yardstick that you want to reach. That's a very, very high yardstick. And that's how you define success. And then if you don't make $1 billion, you're a failure, which is absurd if we are speaking relatively, because what are the chances to become a billionaire yourself? Very low. Does that mean that you're... So there's a lot of work you need to do about how do I define success for me? How do I define success given the family legacy? How do I integrate the legacy into being myself, and how to move forward? It's a lot of work and requires a lot of, trying out things. Expressive writing can help. This is something you can talk on for hours about, particularly when you've walked that path yourself.
Relating a little bit maybe to the story of your father on your birthday, that reminds me a little bit of some of the work that others have done, but I think of people like Matt Wesley, Christian Stewart, and Jay Hughes, who I mentioned earlier, about the value of the family, especially the rising generation members in the family, learning capacity, which is some level of the ability to quote unquote adapt to changing and challenging circumstances, and capability, specific skill sets. There's a little bit of the misconception, it's almost comical, that you're going to learn these things in school, even a good and or a private school. That's not to say that you're not learning some things that are good. I get it. But there's a responsibility that you hinted at earlier to the elders in the family. Just because they're rich and they're busy, they can't outsource effectively the character development, the capacity, the capability of the rising generation in the family. Maybe some of the capability could be passed on to a family office that is good at teaching, fine. But at the end of the day, the buck stops, as we say here in the US, with the elder, the person who produced the child, that has a responsibility, in my opinion. And how does this all intertwine from your experiences as a generational family member and the fact that you work with generational family members? Do families of wealth look to outsource everything in the education of their children? That's gonna fail.
Yes, it is going to fail, or at least make life very difficult for next generation growing up. There's certain things you simply, you can't really outsource. So, and this goes into childhood development, how important it is to spend as much time as possible with your parents in the first 3 years of your life. This is when you build your understanding of trust, because when you're a toddler, you can't do anything yourself. You are 100% dependent on your mother and your father. And when they leave you with a person that is not known to you, you're being abandoned. That leaves certain scars, which then link into your understanding of how do I trust people. And anybody who is very successful in business understands that trusting is being able to understand who to trust and how to trust is very important to be successful in business. It's one of the most important skills. At least that's my opinion on it. And if the parents don't spend the time with you and don't nurture you, particularly in the first 3 years of your life, you're not going to be able to do this properly. And it's going to be you're going to spend a lot of money later on to fix this. And it's, again, I like to say to people, look, if you're a successful entrepreneur and you're a parent, you have both roles to fulfill, and you need to figure out how to make it work. That's your responsibility. If you don't know how to figure it out, don't have children.
100%. Now, I think, again, if you care about your legacy, then I think that number that, as you ended, may not be an option relative to the continuing the family bloodline and heritage, but perhaps a subject, and a sensitive one, that we could save a little bit to a different time. And that relates a little bit to what's going on around the world, to geopolitics, to population issues, to a whole bunch of topics we could probably spend hours on. Related to how I phrased my last question, there are some family offices that do create kind of a chief learning officer position. Probably more so when I mentioned capacity and capability, on the capability side of things, which overall I think is good. If the greatest threat to the family is the family, who in the family office is most dedicated to the family? I agree with that. I think that's positive thinking and a little bit more proactive on the family part. But that doesn't stop the family from being responsible for the character, the morals, the ethics of the child, and a level of responsibility they have to educate and to be active above and beyond school and above and beyond even the family office. But in general, I don't know if that title, that role has taken off in European family offices, but have you seen what we would define, which I think is relatively a new term, as a chief learning officer?
Well, I do like the concept, if I'm being honest. Especially when it comes to learning certain skills, like financial skills, you can outsource it to someone who is more capable to teach the kids than you are. Then there's things like the family history, which is, I forgot where the study is from, but the grandmother is the best person to teach the kids the family history.
I could see that.
Yeah, it's a person of respect. The kids listen, they love the stories from the grandma. If the mother is trying it or some other random person, they're just not interested. It's a totally different scenario when the grandmother is doing it, and there's a certain also respectful position that the grandmother in the family in general takes up, and people respect her. But back to the chief learning officer. I do in Europe, from the families I know, it's still a lot of trust is put into private schools and the capabilities that the family teaches the kids themselves. So I haven't seen it that much here, but if you have the resources for it, and if you have the amount of next gen members that need to be taught the same stuff, it probably makes sense. Either if you get a chief learning officer that you employ, or you look for, let's say, highly qualified tutors that can teach the kids certain skills that they're just not going to learn in school. As you mentioned, most of the things that you need to be an entrepreneur or to be a responsible wealth owner, you don't learn in school. You don't even, you can argue, you probably don't even learn these things in university, depending on the university probably and the course. But at least I can say I didn't learn the things I needed at university or school, really. So it makes total sense to get someone in to support the family on this learning thing. But as you said, character building is something the parents need to take care of, at least when the kids are still very young. So I can see it being useful for certain things and at a certain point. And for some things, you can't outsource it.
Agreed. A topic or an area within that framework of talking about capacity and capability, specifically capability, and potentially the family office in general, or a more formal chief learning officer, the rising generation can be educated on what kinds of businesses make for great investments and how to properly value those kind of business. So if a family office is active direct investing, or even as an LP, having rising generation members of the family be a part of understanding what that looks like, what we look for in the process. Again, you're definitely not going to learn that kindergarten through 12th grade, and even in most college programs, unless very specific. But this is really doing it in the trenches, not in theory in a book. Therefore, I think that would be a great utilization of helping to educate the rising generation from a family office perspective.
Yeah, that's a lot of stuff you just covered that is important for them to learn, but they're not going to learn in school or anywhere else. One thing that ties into this that just came to mind that is really important: the rising generation needs to learn to take ownership and responsibility of things. In many families with wealth, the family office sometimes has a person that's in charge of it, or you have the family members do it themselves. Any mistake or problem that comes up for someone in the rising generation is taken care of for them. Some don't even understand that they like how much money is coming in and how much they're spending, things like that. They need to face the consequences of their decisions when they grow up in order to learn these things. And if you take away these consequences, that's probably like the worst thing you can do.
I think responsibility is incredibly important. I could argue it even is what gives life meaning. And this should begin at the earliest age possible. And again, not something to outsource to a nanny or to a family office, especially at a super young age of the child. This is a responsibility of the parents, and to a little bit lesser degree, the grandparents. Related to what I just said, relative to family office taking a more proactive role, assuming there's interest in the elders and the rising generation upcoming, to even if they have no interest in going into investing in business, understanding kind of like how the sausage is made, how businesses work and run. And that's probably how the family wealth was originally created, I think is still going to be a great exercise for the family to go to. I think the family office should be hosting regular meetings. Some of them are weekly on what's going on in the family office, what progress are we making on goals. I could argue some of that should be daily, by the way, but that's more operational for a different time and a different subject. At minimal, once monthly or once quarterly, to engage the family in the meetings the family office is having. Is this a little bit more pressure and work for the family office? Yes. But at the end of the day, family continuity is king. Isn't that a responsibility of really everyone, the family and the family office, to some degree, for the development capacity and capability of the rising generation? Perhaps I'm looking to intertwine the family, the rising generation, and the family office a little too much. But again, if all I care about is family continuity, and now I'm throwing the right resources at what could help to solve the problem, again, going back to almost inevitable, 3 generations, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves. Do these things that I'm talking about and the further engagement of the family office help to procure family continuity?
They do. I highly agree with all the things you said. Just look at it also from this perspective. If you don't get the next generation involved, they don't get to. So this regular involvement also means that the people working at the family office get to know the next generation, and the next generation gets to know the people at the family office. It is very often the case that when the new generation finally gets to take over, they throw out everybody and get new people.
Yeah, I didn't mention that.
Yeah. So it's also in the employees' personal best interest to get to know the next gens, and to maybe, I'm a big fan, let each next gen have like a little portfolio that they invest in together with the people at the family office, just to understand and learn, make them do it. If you have a family business, make them do internships. If you have a factory, make them, when they're 16 or something, stand 2 weeks at the factory assembly line and actually do the proper hard work, so they know everything inside out. They don't have to enter the business later, but at least they know what they're going to be owning later. And if you don't understand the ins and outs of the things you own, you're not in the position to make good decisions about this later on, and you will have to. And another good way of getting family members engaged is, I'm a big fan of setting up family committees. So you have the family council maybe, but you can set up family committees, or you can call them work groups if you want. Let's say you set up a family marketing committee, which has family members in it that have some sort of knowledge about marketing, and they can work directly with the family's marketing department on things, advise them, get stuck in there. So you can make these topic-specific work groups that give family members the chance to support the family's ventures on a regular basis with the knowledge they have, even if they are in some sort of other job.
I think that's an excellent idea. And maybe from a back to almost a basics question, yet somehow it almost always gets screwed up. So I guess it's important, kind of intergenerational communication, or really the lack thereof. A fallacy is to think that actual good communication is taking place. It's usually not. And whether it's more the elders or the rising generation, probably it's a combination. But especially as the rising generation is younger and doesn't have the experience or the know-how that the elders do, perhaps that does fall a little bit more on quote unquote the parents, and I guess I could say the grandparents. In the work that you do with your company, how do you help to foster active listening and better communication? And is it simply just having committees and retreats, or is it more nuanced than that?
Well, so first of all, teaching the next generation how to communicate properly, of course, falls onto the elders, because how do children, particularly when they're young, how do they learn? They copy what they see. So the best way to teach communication is by being able to communicate properly with each other. And then again, you need to spend a lot of time with the kids to be able to teach them and show them how it's done properly. So if you don't have a good culture of communication in your family, and you can probably start trying to trace it back generations where it started, but it falls on the elders' responsibility to foster this. Of course, when the next generation gets to a certain age, they're adults, they're grown-ups, they can decide themselves how they communicate and how they don't. But it is what is given with you at a young age that you transport forward. So that's like kind of like the basis of understanding. So if you have a family where the communication isn't great, it depends that you try and see where are they at. Are they too aggressive in their communication, or are they too passive in their communication? And what is their mindset around conflict? Because usually people see conflict as something bad that needs to be avoided. I like to try and tell people and show them that conflict is actually not something that you need to avoid and that is bad. It is good, depending on how you carry out the conflict. So we're coming into productive conflict. How can I have a disagreement with someone in a productive way with the goal to come out afterwards with a better outcome than when we went in? So this boils down to creativity. So if you give a person a blank piece of paper and say, draw me something, they're going to sit and not know what to do. If you tell them, draw me a house, they will draw your house pretty quickly, and maybe in some sort of creative way, they color it some sort. So a conflict and a disagreement gives you this framework to work within and come up with creative solutions. But it's the mindset to understand that a conflict gives you this opportunity to create something better afterwards. That great families have this instilled, and they can have productive conflict, and they find solutions. So that's either you have to get a family down a notch because they're just screaming at each other, or you have to push them up a notch to make sure that these tensions that they're having with each other come up to the surface. And then there's a lot of just basic communication skills of how do you foster good communication, how do you have disagreements. This comes down to a lot of different techniques that you can use.
I mean, I sometimes, and not to be critical of rising generation and Gen Z, but don't be average. A lot of average people have difficulties dealing with boredom, with temptations, and some of that comes from the overconsumption and how addictive social media's, TikTok, IG stories, whatever. But life is not about being entertained 24/7. Sometimes it is kind of mundane. To get to the top, having a purpose, having a focus, going through struggle, and putting in the focused work. So I agree, the elders have a responsibility, especially at the young age of the rising generation. And I think the family office does as well. But sometimes there comes a point, inevitably, where at the end of the day, don't play the victim, don't make excuses, and don't get caught up in being average. You don't want to be average. And unfortunately, with some of the temptations today, it may be harder than it has been in the past, but these are things that I look at a little deeper. And I don't know if I have great solutions to. Maybe some of it is simply be an active parent, an active grandparent, be loving, be caring, be tough when you need to be tough, but be there. Don't just outsource.
Yeah, I agree. It comes down, especially the last thing you said. I'm a big fan of saying, okay, you got to be there, and that's most of the work is just being there. Then you have done a lot of things correct already. But as you said, everybody is in charge of themselves, and after a certain age, and that starts earlier than you would think, you're responsible for your own decisions, your thoughts, your actions. And that's something that you can also instill very early into kids, to say, okay, you're responsible for yourself, you need to make decisions yourself, and teach them to have this capability. And after a certain age, you need to take the rudder into your hands and steer your life and focus on what you are in control of. And really, you can argue it's not even the thoughts you have that you're fully in control of, but for argument's sake, it's your thoughts and your decisions and the actions you take. That's the only things that you're in control of.
100%.
And if I make a decision and take an action, and it was rather dumb to have done this, I can't just blame someone else. It was me. Got to be responsible for it.
And perhaps my last question, and maybe a little bit of a quasi fun, a little bit tongue in cheek exercise. You mentioned in part one, I mentioned early on, and you might have reiterated it today in part two, the importance of families back perhaps centuries ago being active and sequential, often with the oldest son down to younger, in let's be active in politics and military and clergy. Do those three still hold up today? Now, of course, the right answer is your children, again, should get your love, should get your attention, and should do what they want to do and have the courage and responsibility to take their own actions, not what you want to shove them into. That being said, that would be a boring answer. So, of course, we have to give a little bit more engaging. What would be three things for families that do care about their legacy? And let's assume the rising generation's on board listening to the elders on that. Is it still politics, military, and clergy? Or in today's world, did we actually hint at it early on? It would be starting companies, being an entrepreneur. Would it probably still be political because that's influential? But a lot of families also are active in charitable inclinations. They have foundations, and having a family member be incredibly active in that. Now, you could argue nefariously that could be influencing public policy. But again, we're talking a little bit about the impact that incredibly affluent families may have. And maybe I would look at those three. I don't know if military still holds up now, centuries later. And I'm not so sure that clergy. Now, that's a very loaded topic. We could go in many different directions on that one. But that would probably be my two or three top three in today's world.
That's a difficult question. The world has changed a lot since then.
Yes.
So I would argue that the clergy, and in many countries, the military hasn't got the same amount of standing and power than it used to.
100%. Yes.
So those would have fallen out of the top three in many places. Again, that can change, particularly with the military, if times change. And there is some countries where you still have a lot of power by just being in the military. So I think it's hard to, first of all, generalize this for every country in the world. But I think politics, and I would put politics and lobbying into one bucket, because some families don't want any family member in politics, but they are still able to politically influence a lot of the decisions. So having some sort of foothold in political decisions is important from a family standpoint. Again, what you do with this power is a different conversation we can have for a very long time. And if every family is using it for something good or something bad, it's another discussion. And philanthropy, I think, has always been an important thing for families. One of my ancestors, he built a lot of hospitals in Austria for the common people, where they could get medical help for free back in the day. So just as one example. And nowadays, a lot of foundations, especially when they have a lot of capital to deploy, have some power that, again, can link back to the family. So, and into the family's branding. Again, people say you shouldn't do philanthropic things because of branding, but in the end, if you do, it puts the family in a better light. It's also a marketing exercise, if you're being really honest. So that we would be at 2 areas there, and maybe, not sure if it still holds true, but investment and banking is an area that has a lot of power these days. So that would probably be my third.
And I'm going to throw a fourth in there. So this is, again, I wouldn't quite say tongue in cheek, but meant to be a little bit engaging to the audience because times have changed. Like you said, clergy has probably fell out. And let's be honest, it was probably there from the perspective of families of wealth and kingdoms having an opportunity to have a forum to be able to dictate and to have an impact, have an influence on a massive population. That's not to say that there weren't people in it for truly the cause from their heart and their belief. I'm sure there were, but there were, you could argue, some nefarious reasons behind it as well. What has maybe taken the place of that today? Well, it popped in my head, Octavian. It's media. So owning a media empire, especially via social media today, I mean, you look at some TikTok stars, they literally have over 50 million. I mean, maybe some of them are fake, I don't know, but it sounds like a lot to me. They have a lot of influence. So that would probably, maybe it's not 3, maybe it's 4. So we got to expand it. And that will be Angelo's addition to the 4th.
I think the world has become a bit more complex. So there is way more areas that you can choose from where you could or should have family members active in than back in the day. You could also argue professional sports in some sense didn't exist back in the day as it is now. So if you have a family member who is a football star, that is probably coming again also with certain perks for the family, and that will help them in the legacy. So I think as you said, it's more complex, and the buckets you can put people in have increased in numbers.
Indeed. And I think it's about time for us to wrap up. Before I give a close, if you wanted to wrap up a little bit of some of your comments for a minute or 2 to our audience, that would be fantastic.
Oh, we talked about a lot of things, but let me try and summarize the most important points for me. So, number 1, don't underestimate the value of education for your next generation, and that you should start as early as possible with this, and that it actually is something that you as a family are responsible to get stuck in yourself. Secondly, with that, it's one of my favorite things to say is if you have a next generation, you're not just a CEO, but you're also a parent, maybe a grandparent, an uncle, or an aunt. Take all the roles you have seriously and make it work somehow. And that ties into what we said at the beginning. Education is probably the most important, and spending time with the next generation is the most important thing you can do to transform the family members from being a liability into being an advantage for the family.
Excellent. And for those that would like to learn more, how to follow you, how to reach out, how to learn more about some of the work you do, working with elders and rising generations and families, how can they reach out and learn more?
Well, obviously, I have a LinkedIn profile. You can feel free to message me on LinkedIn. I do also have a web page where I also have a blog, which is www.octavianpilati.com. If you put my name in Google, you will find me. It's pretty easy to reach me.
That is true. And by the way, that's Octavian and last name Pilati, P as in Peter, Ilati. And I highly encourage reaching out, following him on LinkedIn. And I've enjoyed my conversations in person and digitally. My conclusion, pretty much kind of, I guess, similar in some ways to Octavian. One, it's been great to get to know him, to meet him in person in Vienna back in December of 2023. We're now ballpark about a month later and doing the digital interview, kind of a part two. And I look forward to communicating, to keeping in touch and having him on in the future. I think these are incredible subjects and insight from a family of resources that goes back the level of time that yours. And I met one other that also goes back over 1,000+ years and multiple when I was in Vienna and broadly Europe that go back 500 to 750 years. I think there's lessons learned, and I love to bring that to my audience. I, of course, love to talk about economics, investing, structural issues in the family office. I mean, I actually like that subject. Taxes, wealth transfer, all very, very important. But I think some of these subjects, which to some of you may not be as engaging or exciting, I don't know why. To me, this is like the bloodline of the family. This is really kind of what makes it tick. And I just don't think the community that I was a part of for so many decades, me being the founder and longtime CEO at Family Office Association, we didn't bring these things to the forefront probably as much as we could. It was maybe a sidebar in a breakout room or an occasional big name philanthropic or family keynote over lunch. And part of that is due to a level of ignorance. You learn. Part of it is due to you need to help to teach the families and the executives what is the greatest threat, yet also the advantage, and understand the importance of that and weave in these stories, these intellect, these values that you get. And as many of you heard me mention, part of it, and again, I was a part of it, I get it, is simply from a event perspective. These are not really profitable. There's like no sponsorship for the most part. There should be. Companies in legal, accounting, and finance, as opposed to always talking about those topics, should be helping to organize or bring together topics like this that we're discussing today. But unfortunately, basically 99% of what's out there is heavily conflicted. And some of them may do their best. There may be some good content here or there, but it's a challenge. So I do enjoy what I do at Family Office TV. I hope you enjoy some of the interviews in a little bit different and probably more longer form than what many of you are used to. But to really do the deep dive and to meet peers like this around the world and to interact on my deepest work that I do for families, SFO continuity as a private consultant and membership organization, and my educational platforms at Family Office Masterclass and how they're immersive. Really everything that I do, and travel the world with me. Why not? These are all things that we could kind of do together, and you can learn more very simply at angelorobles.com. I don't have all the answers. I have more questions than I have answers. Still trying to figure things out, even decades in. Being a lifelong learner and being kind of a beginner in my mindset is still very important to me. So hopefully you enjoy some of the content that I put on and reach out and learn more to be more active as a participant and truly get the hands-on guidance and learning as I'm doing it as well. On that note, thank you all very much. You can follow me across effectively all social platforms. You can find it. And again, at angelorobles.com. Octavian, it's been great to see you, however, digitally. I look forward to being back in hopefully both Austria and broadly Europe this spring. It'll be a pleasure. And thank you again for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you as well.
Thank you.